person here. I just wanted, before I started, to say thank y'all so much to BSides NoVA for having me out here, and thank you all so much to all of you for being here. This is amazing. Can we all start by giving a round of applause to the organizers for being fantastic? Because they are. Did something weird happen with my mic? Can you still hear me? You good? Okay. Hey, so my name is Ian Coldwater, and this talk is called Cross-Node Networking, Bridging the Container and Security Communities, or DevOps and Security Communities, because I wanted to fit as many bad networking puns as I could into a single title. It does not actually involve electronics networking, despite the picture of cables. It's about people networking, but I like bad puns, so I cannot lie. My name is Ian Coldwater, and I'm an independent security consultant who lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I specialize in hacking and hardening Kubernetes, containers, and cloud infrastructure. And I travel around and speak a lot, and to both DevOps audiences and to security audiences about these topics. So to DevOps audiences, it's, here are the security considerations that you're going to need to think about when you're setting up an environment like that. To the security audiences, it's like, here are these technologies and these tools, here's how they exist, here's what their attack surface looks like, how they work, and how you can either go about attacking it or securing it. So one of the things, I'm gonna walk and get water, because that's really far away. One of the things that being able to speak a lot to those different audiences has allowed me to do is get an idea of what those communities think about each other and what they say about each other, and like what they're learning, what their understandings are, what their pain points are, and what they want to see happen. And so having been in the position of being able to do this, which is pretty cool, I wanted to come bring some of those perspectives to you, distill them together, and come up with some of my own ideas about maybe how we can move forward and work better together. So what's this talk all about? The DevOps and security communities have a fair amount of overlap. But it's like a Venn diagram with the overlap in the middle and a lot on either side. There are a lot of gaps in communication. A lot of the time people just don't talk to each other, or when they do talk to one another, it's not always the most positive conversation. There's a lot of gaps in knowledge. A fair amount of kind of container cloud native developers lack some amount of security knowledge, and a fair amount of security people lack some kind of understanding about how more modern cloud native technologies work. And there's a gap in understanding, both in terms of just literal understanding of how the things work, and in terms of understanding of one another and people's goals, where they're coming from and what they're going for. So let's talk about how we got to this place and how we could go about moving forward. First things first. Everything that I'm saying right now is kind of bullshit. Because this dichotomy is false. What is a community? Is a community monolithic? Are we all part of the same community? Do all of the members of the community believe or understand the same things? No, probably not. Probably not worldwide, probably not across any number of, reasons why varied cliques within a community exist. So there's that, the idea of there being a singular monolithic DevOps community or a singular monolithic security community, kind of nonsense. You should take me with a big grain of salt. The other thing is that dichotomy is false because DevOps and security belong together. They're not two separate things that don't intersect or shouldn't intersect. I think a lot of us know that, which is why the term DevSecOps exists. Have people heard of DevSecOps? Raise your hand if you have some understanding of what that means. Every single one of you has a different understanding of what that means. There's an old joke that if you ask people, what DevOps is, 20 people, you'll get 21 different answers. DevSecOps might even be worse because it's another buzzword set on top of a buzzword that there already isn't a consensus for meaning toward. So DevOps as a concept started out as, wait, did I put that? Oh, wait, no. DevOps as a concept started out cultural. It's the idea that development and operations should not be working at separate ends, separately from one another. Historically, developers would, be on their feature sprint. They would throw things over the wall to operations, maybe on a Friday, like 4 o'clock. They go home, they're done with their sprint, they're good to go. Operations then has to deal with the broken things that the developers just threw at them, and they're up until 2 in the morning on Saturday, and they're all mad, right? Historically, this is like where this idea came from. And the idea from DevOps originally was that, you break down these walls and developers and operations work more closely together such that developers have more ownership over their product, operations have kind of more of an understanding and work more closely with the devs, and people are able to use that, more common understanding and working more closely together to be able to, make better software more efficiently, continuous improvement, drive things to become better. So DevOps originally, cultural idea. What do we think of now when we think of DevOps? Often we think of tools. We think of, infrastructure as code. We think of Terraform. We think of Ansible. We think of CI/CD pipelines. We think of containers or container orchestration, which is kind of the thing I do. And that's not what DevOps is supposed to be. The problem with this utter lack of consensus of what this means is that DevOps hiring is kind of broken, for one thing. If you have somebody who's looking for, a DevOps person, that can mean absolutely anything. So going back a bit, because I come from DevOps, just trying to explain how this works, the DevSecOps actually kind of adds this nebulous concept to this already nebulous concept. And what does that mean? Does it mean that we should be putting more security tools into our existing CI/CD pipelines? Does it mean that we should be shifting security left? Does it mean that we should be working more closely together? There's not a consensus on this at all. And the thing is, so we know that this dichotomy is false. We know that these things belong together. Everybody, I think, wants to make better products, probably most of the time, who's making products, or break their products well, whatever. But these things, even though I think a lot of us sort of want these things to happen, it doesn't really work very well. The pain points are real. The lack of understanding is real. The relationships being kind of frayed is a real problem. And the struggle, it's a real issue. So we need to acknowledge that these gaps do exist, and acknowledging silos is the first step to being able to break them down. Because silos are for grain. So how did we get to this place? How did these flaws come to be? If we consider the fact that so many security issues come from these gaps in knowledge and understanding, we could consider this to itself be a security flaw in software, in the way that software is made. So if we're looking at this like we would look at a CVE, like we would look at a vulnerability, how did this happen? What are the moving parts that combined to make this issue come open? DevOps! Sparkliest, ugliest unicorns I could find. So I come from DevOps, that's my background. DevOps, we're awesome. We can build amazing things. We have so much energy. We can really improve efficiency across the software development lifecycle. We can move at the speed of whatever we can manage. We can, just really push the industry forward in terms of technology, in terms of speed, in terms of everything else. That's awesome. But it's not always entirely awesome. Because moving fast and breaking things isn't always a good thing. Security can be an afterthought or seen as a blocker. Has anyone here read the book, The Phoenix Project, at all? A few of you? So I'm going to explain it. Apologies to the people who have read it. The Phoenix Project is a sort of thinly veiled editorial disguised as a novel. And it's kind of like when people get their first DevOps job, somebody gives them a copy of The Phoenix Project. It's pretty short. And the Phoenix Project is kind of like I said, it's a story about a business in which developers and operations are not getting along and everything's terrible and the business is falling apart. And they figure out how to break down the silos and work together, and everybody lives happily ever after in the end. Awesome. There is a security person in the Phoenix project. That person is the villain. He is the only character who has no redeeming qualities whatsoever and does not get redeemed in any way whatsoever at the end of the book. People start out really disliking him. He's kind of a jerk. People don't like the way that he works with them. He blocks their software. He poops on their ideas. They, generally find him to be very unpleasant. And the developers and operations learn to understand each other and work well together. And the security guy, as those silos break down, that silo stays intact. Nobody likes the security guy. He stays off in the corner. And the fact that this is this foundational text of DevOps, I think really speaks to the fact that really, I think relationships with security and security teams have not necessarily improved. So let's think of ways that we could, try to make this better. Because right now, this is the deal with those sparkly unicorns. Everybody is, making rainbows and sparkles and then throwing it over a different wall, and security is having to deal with that after the fact. Thank you to Pete Cheslock, if you're watching this, for that image. It's fantastic. So sometimes DevOps can move faster than the speed of communication. We make things so quickly that we don't even document things for ourselves because it'll be different next week. There's no point. We'll just have to redo it. So we don't necessarily communicate things to each other, to end users, or to security people. And we're moving so fast that this creates this divergence that I should have made on a slide, but I'm just going to do as a hand gesture, which is basically like zoom. And that, one of those is moving much faster and at a much higher trajectory than the other. So this can create, some gaps. And some would argue that some knowledge never got transferred to DevOps either. And this includes security knowledge. I hear a lot, things like, what do you mean there are Kubernetes instances that just exist on Shodan with no auth on them? What are you talking about? How could this be? How could you have, made this design decision when we, as people who were LAMP stack developers or sysadmins or whatever in 2003, knew that this was a bad idea? What the hell? I get this a lot from security folks. And the answer is that a lot of the time, DevOps people are, maybe newer, maybe more excitable. Maybe nobody's ever told them that that was a thing that they shouldn't be doing. And the kind of older school, graybeard Unix sysadmins who might have more of that knowledge aren't necessarily telling the DevOps people that either. They're just sort of being like, oh, what are you doing? And a lot of older school sysadmins have a lot of feelings about DevOps, the ways that it's affected their work, the way that it's affected their job prospects, sort of the ways that things get done. And those feelings are really valid. But there's a lot of institutional knowledge that isn't really being transferred. And on the other end, DevOps isn't really transferring knowledge either. They're too busy moving fast. So this is a tweet from Dan Kaminsky. I asked him if he could use it. He said I could. And I think about this tweet all the time because because it's real. Because the speed that development is moving in terms of cloud native development, in terms of the things that people are making around cloud stuff, in terms of modern tech stacks, again, moving at this trajectory. And security is still, security moves a lot slower, and for valid reasons. For one thing, compliance is a thing that a lot of people have to think about, and compliance moves at the speed of your average glacier. There are no PCI compliance guidelines for the cloud. Period. I'm not kidding at all. We tried to do a network segmentation test on a cluster a little while ago on a pen test engagement and discovered that they were like, how do we translate this to our requirements as we have them written? And the answer was, that's a great question. Nobody's done that. I am not personally interested enough in compliance to do this, but there is absolutely money in somebody making these things and having a business consulting about it. Here, have a free business idea. I have no desire to do it, but somebody should, because there is just not, that stuff just really hasn't translated. And a lot of the understandings that we have about security and how to secure things often kind of break with modern tech stacks. if you have an idea of the network perimeter as being the thing you have to secure, or of like the 8 layers of OSI, 7, I guess, if, of the OSI, like, stack, and, if those are your understandings of how things work, if you're thinking about the physical cables, if you're thinking about, a monolithic thing with a perimeter surrounding it, the fact that software-defined networking doesn't look like a monolith at all, or that microservice architectures could potentially break your understandings of like what connects to what at what time, the idea that like actually all things are defined by APIs rather than, actual physical networks that are happening, can kind of break some people's understanding of how things work. And taking a sip of water. Containers are ephemeral. They're designed to be destroyed, they're designed to be put back. And like tools that we have, like vulnerability scanners or whatever, will, they take snapshots of a moment in time, and that makes sense if your system is static. It does not necessarily make sense for a system that has no state at all. People haven't really built these tools out yet, not on the security side. And, and security, like, as a pen tester, when I was not mostly doing Kubernetes container pen testing, I was pretty horrified before I became a pen tester at how old school the OSCP was. If any of y'all have taken the OSCP before, like, you have to compile for a kernel from 2003 in one of those boxes and like do a multi-library thing because a lot of the tech in there is so old. And I was like, oh my goodness, like what, this seems really kind of quaint. I'm sure that people are seeing different things out in the wild. And the kind of awkward answer is that maybe that was from 2005, but much of InfoSec is still looking at 2010. If any of y'all work as pen testers, you're still seeing the LAMP stack, you're still seeing XP, you're still seeing Windows 7 and SMB1 and getting DA the same way over and over and over. And those things can often move slow too. And so I think it's easy on some level for security folks to be like, well, we're fine. Like this works well enough. We're doing the things that we understand, we're seeing the things that we know, we see the same things over and over a lot of the time. And we don't need to figure this stuff out. But the thing is that the industry is moving without us. And we need to be able to move forward, to be able to keep up with it, to be able to keep up. Because if we don't, we become irrelevant. And what happens when security becomes irrelevant? Do things become secure? Probably not, right? What happens when security people no longer understand the technology that they're trying to secure at all in some cases? Does the product become more secure from that? Probably not. So we need to be moving forward, even if we're not necessarily seeing this stuff yet. We need to be understanding it, and we need to be figuring out strategies for how to move forward with it. Because if we don't, as I said, we get left behind, and that's good for nobody. So let's talk about the security community for a minute. I have never played Digimon, but I really appreciate the large amount of female hacker cartoons, that's in scare quotes for anybody who can't see me, that now exist because of these Digimon characters, so thanks Digimon. But let's talk about the security community. Security people tend to be a little more paranoid than DevOps people, for valid reasons. Many of us have great reasons to be paranoid because we see a lot of crap, we maybe do a lot of crap. You kind of get more of an idea of maybe people who think like attackers or like bad actors. And security tends to be more insular for, again, valid reasons, maybe shyness, maybe paranoia, maybe just, wanting to talk to people who have a shared community and shared references. They tend to only talk to one another a lot of the time. Security tends to be really insular. And what that means is that for one thing, again, knowledge isn't being shared. For another thing, it means that security thinks differently than DevOps. DevOps and developers in general tend to be well-intentioned people who tend to assume good. And this doesn't only affect software security. As I said, it affects the philo communities themselves. And it affects the ways that people get along. DevOps people don't really like security people a lot of the time, unfortunately. Developers don't really like security people a lot of the time either. This is not unique to the Phoenix project, unfortunately. And I'm going to keep going with this for a minute, not to shame everybody, but because we really need to understand how much of an issue this is. People in internal organizations see security as the team of no. They're like, they're the people who block our projects, who make things slower, who are just like really unpleasant to work with because they make things harder for us. And they're just unpleasant a lot of the time. A thing I hear from DevOps people a lot is like, I don't know how you work with those folks. They're awful. They're abrasive, they're mean to each other, they have no manners, and I don't know how you deal with it. And I'm like, no, they're really nice. Like, people are really cool. They really help each other a lot. And they're like, they help each other a lot, but they're not necessarily helping outside of each other. And so one thing I think that security people could do better is by working with, helping, and communicating with, building better relationships with people outside of ourselves. Because security people, I think, are pretty awesome. I think a lot of us think security people are pretty awesome. It's why we're here. But I think that we have this bad reputation, earned or not, and I think we might want to try to unearn it a little bit. I have this twice, I guess. I don't know how that happened. So we could all look at that again. So if we're looking at this as a vulnerability in software, if we're doing an analysis on like what this means, how it works, what do we have here if we're putting this together? What we've got here is a failure to communicate. We can do better. We can communicate better with one another. We can communicate better with other folks on other teams if we work on internal teams. We can communicate better with our clients if we're consulting. We can communicate better with the people around us. And we need to, because the risk here is less secure software for everybody, worse relationships, and bigger gaps. The gaps in knowledge and understandings on all sides have happened for often valid reasons, and not with malicious intent. But they have happened, and here we are now. So if we've analyzed this vulnerability, if we know how it happened, let's talk about that vulnerability's impact. What kind of risks are there to leave this CVE out in the wild? For one thing, we get bugs. We get bugs from developers leaving giant security holes that those of us who know how to spot them can easily see, that maybe they don't know about. Maybe they wouldn't catch because they maybe don't know any better. We get confusion. We get, Kubernetes had a big CVE that came out a couple of months ago that was both a local privilege escalation vulnerability and a remote code execution vulnerability, depending on how your API servers were configured. People were very confused by this. People were like, I don't understand how it can be both. And if you explain how like the back end of Kubernetes works and how aggregated API servers work, it makes sense. But there was enough of a gap in understanding there that people were just like, I don't understand. Like, how could an LPE be a 9.8 CVSS score? That doesn't make any sense. And the fact that that confusion existed speaks to our failure as DevOps people to communicate how that stuff works and communicate these things to security folks, because security folks know the freaking difference between an LPE and an RCE, right? Like, we all do, a lot of us do. And it really, that's not on security, that's on us as DevOps people to have that conversation in a more clear way to increase that understanding. It can create cats and dogs living together, bad things happening. I just had to post a picture of a cat and dog. But really what it creates is less secure software for all. It creates a less secure build process, it creates less secure products, and it creates less security across the industry. That's no good. I don't think any of us really want that, or at least very few of us do. For the black hats in the room, I apologize, I'm not talking about you, maybe you do want that. We can do better. We can do better. We can communicate better. We can work together more closely to make more secure products. This can be done. How? How can these flaws be remediated? What is the mitigation here? How do we get this CVE to be less common in the wild? Again, DevSecOps as a concept, maybe. Maybe that needs to be explained better. Maybe shifting security left needs to happen. Totally possible. But the fact that that concept exists as a buzzword has not solved the problem yet. We need to communicate better. We need to communicate better, again, like with our teams, with each other, with other folks. And that can look any number of ways. We need to engage with each other more on this side of the news cycle so that there aren't confusions around what kind of CVE and CVS score, SS score means what, that there is just more understanding of what's going on both sides. And how can we do that? We can reach out to each other outside of our bubbles and talk more across those chasms. For example, we can get people who are DevOps people to be talking as a DevOps person at security conferences, like I'm doing right now. Likewise, a thing that you could do as security people is go to developer conferences, go to DevOps conferences, because things that we think are obvious are often really, really not obvious. That knowledge that you have that you're like, that's so boring, who would want to hear about that? No matter how junior you are, no matter what side of the chasm you're on, you probably have information that other people don't have. And so, really I want to encourage you to do that, to talk to other folks, because your average developer doesn't actually know what a cross-site scripting vulnerability is, how you might spot one in code, or how you might fix it. It's pretty basic stuff to some people, but not to everybody. Last October, I spoke at 4 conferences in a month or something. And I flew straight from Velocity, which is a big DevOps conference in New York, to DerbyCon, and spoke about Kubernetes at both places. And I want to tell a story about this because I think it's indicative of the fact that so many of us have this knowledge that we really think is basic that isn't necessarily. So at Velocity, I was talking about how I was about to go speak at Kubernetes at Derby, and it was the first talk about Kubernetes at a con like that. And I was like, I had made this really kind of elaborate deep dive with an attack chain and walking through it, and was really excited about teaching people about container escapes. And I got there, and people were like, "What's a container? How's it work? Is it a VM?" And I was like, "Oh no!" And then I had to rewrite the talk. So, I was telling the container folks about this, and they were like, "What do you mean they haven't heard of Kubernetes? What do you mean they think that a container is a VM? That doesn't make, a VM is a virtual machine, I'm sorry. That doesn't make any sense. How could they not know that? We do this all day long. Everybody knows about this." It's not necessarily so. In that conversation also, somebody brought up Kali Linux, because people were talking about their favorite Linux distributions, because that's what we talk about at dinner, I guess, in a group of really brilliant engineers, not dumb people, really, really brilliant people doing amazing things in the cloud native space. None of them had heard of Kali Linux before, at all. They were like, "What's that?" And it was like, "Oh, okay." So I went back to DerbyCon and was having dinner there, and was telling them about that conversation, and they were like, "What do you mean they haven't heard of Kali Linux? We do that all day long. Who hasn't heard of Kali Linux? Everybody knows that." But the thing is that, again, things like that we think of as being so basic that they're not even worth mentioning are not necessarily that basic, and might be worth mentioning to be able to increase this understanding, to lift all the boats at the same time. Because right now, that chasm exists, and how are we going to be able to get across it except by bringing up everybody's knowledge such that they're able to even have enough of a common shared understanding to be able to talk to each other, to move forward. Container folks can sometimes seem like they're speaking an entirely different language. And container folks spend enough time with each other that it doesn't seem like an issue. And sometimes I will talk about containers, some people will be like, "I literally have no idea what you're talking about." None of those words make any sense to me in context. What? So one thing that DevOps people can do is step back and create those shared understandings. And security people do this too. How many acronyms do we have? DFIR, XSS, CSRF, there's piles of them. We can fit as many of them into a single talk as possible, and everybody who is not already familiar with those acronyms will be like, "I didn't understand any of that." And so one thing that we can do is, for example, spell out our acronyms before the first time that we use them, and then we could just use acronyms forever after that, and that's fine. But make sure to, again, bring up other people's understanding, because not everything is obvious to everyone. Yeah, security, again, good at knowledge sharing internally, but they need to share outside too. We need to lift all the boats. We need to rise the tide so that all of us can move up together. But we need to do that at the same time. And right now, with that diverging trajectory, somebody who's moving at the speed of security, even if they're keeping up at their speed, is not necessarily going to keep up with the upper end of that trajectory. So it's not that people need to slow down, it's that people need to create these commonalities and shared understandings so that we can have these conversations, speak the same language, and be able to move forward together. And how do we go about doing that? For one thing, security and DevOps can both bring what they're good at, because both of those communities have things that they're really, really good at. And in fact, every one of us can bring what we're good at. Every person in this room has something to teach and something to learn. Probably more than one thing to teach and more than one thing to learn from each other. And that's really valuable. And we shouldn't be selling that short, not in ourselves, not in our communities. Let's take the best of what our communities have to offer, combine them, and work together to build something better. What can we learn from DevOps? DevOps principles can inspire us. The cultural idea of DevOps is pretty cool at its core. If we need to build new cultures, if we need to not be attached to how things have always been done, in order to create continuous improvement, in order to drive efficiency, in order to make things better, push everything forward, we can learn from the way that DevOps has done that in a lot of ways. Because in theory, DevOps is really good at this. Let's take the best of those principles. Breaking silos down, approaching with empathy, improving continuously, and expand upon them. We can be agile in doing this. We can iterate, and we can use that energy that DevOps brings as we build something better. And what does security bring? It's not just blocking people and being the poopers of dreams. Security can contribute what it's good at as well. Being able to think like an attacker can help when trying to defend from one, or build something with a process that keeps that kind of thought process in mind. Security's ability to threat model and calculate risk can be a good balance for people who have a tendency to assume good users using their features that they're building in the way that they're intended. And security's ability to think outside the box, to look at all angles and find the way in, doesn't hurt for building new and better things either. Security isn't a blocker, it's necessary. It tempers things and it makes them stronger. Ultimately, we're all on the same side. We need to work together more, we need to communicate better, and we need to remember that we need each other. Improving these issues benefits all of us. Together, we are stronger. And what we build, or even break, becomes stronger too. We need to build better relationships. This can take various forms. If you are working on an internal team and you are trying to communicate with your developers or your DevOps people or whoever that maybe you think that design decision is questionable, there is something to be said for kind of basic politeness here. Being that's awful. That's really insecure. Why would you do that? That's the worst. No. Pull request denied. If that is all you ever communicate to them, they're not going to enjoy working with you. They're going to be all you do is poop on our stuff, tell me that my baby is ugly, and just tell me no on stuff. And that's and besides the sort of more nebulous kind of warm fuzzy aspect of that, it's not actionable feedback to tell people your stuff's insecure. Okay. What do I do with that? How do I make it more secure? Do you have suggestions? How does this process work? And a lot of the time, we're not necessarily super good at doing that. And again, there's valid reasons for that. I've also worked in security. I understand seeing the same vulns over and over and over, and the same mistakes being made over and over, and getting jaded and getting annoyed, and starting to maybe blame the users or blame the devs and just be why are you not learning? This is the worst, And you start to get kind of grumpy after a while. I get it. I get how it happens. But if we aren't giving people actionable feedback, they can't act on it. They just hate us, and that's no good. So that's one way we could do it. And in general, how, I've given this talk once before to a more container-centric audience. And people went up to me after who both considered themselves container people and security people. And were like, and they all had the same story, but not necessarily from the same side, which is like, I have so much trouble in my organization working with the other team. That team is so difficult to work with. The devs are really arrogant. They think they know everything. They build this crap. It's terrible. When I tell them that, they don't like it. And the security people, they really just don't want to listen to like what we're trying to do with those design decisions, and they're not giving us actionable feedback at all. This is really difficult. How do we approach this? And additionally, people were asking the same question over and over, which was, how do I even begin to have this conversation? Because when I'm trying to explain those design decisions, people just don't know what I'm talking about. They'll be like, what's that? What do you mean? I don't get it. So I think we're talking past each other right now, and we can stop talking past each other by, again, like creating these shared understandings so that we can have a shared language, so that we're not just, moving at, not necessarily parallel and not very friendly paths. So how do you do that? You meet people where they are. You approach them with empathy. Because generally speaking, that security person, as many of you security people in the room know, is not actually trying to poop on people's dreams all day, right? Like, that's not what most of us are trying to do with our time. And that developer is not actually trying to make terrible, insecure decisions all day long and make your life sad. Like, where are people coming from? And this is especially the case once communication breakdowns have started to happen. But preferably, you can do this before communication breakdowns start to happen. What's going on there? What are their goals? What do they want? Where are they coming from on this? Is it that they're really stressed out about trying to get through their sprint? Are they on some sort of crazy crunch time deadline that they're concerned about? Is it that they are, maybe somebody's concerned about the legal risk inherent in being out of compliance? Maybe somebody is, like what is happening there? What is the goal? What are they trying to do? And how does their pursuit of that goal affect the way that they are dealing with this problem and the way that they are dealing with you? So if somebody's feeling very stressed out about their deadlines, maybe they're going to be especially salty if security takes 6 days to respond back to the pull request with a no, If somebody is, really wanting to move something forward because they feel really passionate about it, maybe they want to communicate in a way that communicates that excitement, and maybe they're going to react badly when people are like, that's an awful idea, Think about what people want, what they're going for. Try to hold on to that. And at the same time, think about what people are trying to do and try to get there together. So once you've met people where they are, create those shared understandings, create that shared model of communication. And once you have a common understanding of what the problem set is, what problem you're trying to solve, you can try to figure out how to solve it together. And that's really valuable. And on the one hand, that sort of seems obvious. And on the other hand, we're not always good at it. And I think we could be better. So meet people where they are, bring them up with you, and then figure out how to move forward collectively. We can break down the walls. Together, we can come up with new paradigms. We are building collectively, and I say we, partly DevOps, but we, all of us, a new technological world. We're living in it. That's awesome. That's really exciting. We need to make technology that's worthy of that. And we need to act in ways that are worthy of that so that we can push the entire industry forward, make more secure products, and treat each other better, because it's important. Together, we can do that. We can build those paradigms. We can reach across those chasms. We can communicate with one another better. We can do it. Doing that will benefit us all. That's a pretty rainbow. I believe in every single one of you. And thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.